Go.
Welcome to DD Hangout. Today we'll be discussing the topics of end users as an increasing target of cybercrime. I'm Jason Harris. I'm the managing principal consultant for security and end user compute in the US. And today I'm joined by Jaco Hatting, who is the global GM for enterprise mobility in our end user computing business, and Neville Burden, who is the GM for end user compute business in Asia Pacific. Before we get started on today's discussion, please take note, if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, if you could post them on the Google Plus event page or on our Twitter page using the hashtag DD Hangouts, that would be great, because then we can respond to them as soon as we can afterwards. So just as an introduction, I don't know how many of you attended the last DD Hangout, which was focused on our Global Threat Intelligence report, but one of the areas that is very clear in that report is that the user has actually become the new perimeter of an organization, and particularly with access to key systems and key data often, and usually on devices that aren't either completely managed or managed at all by the organization. And also what we've seen heavily is the shift from of attacks from the actual application to the user, so targeting the user as, if you like, the soft center. If we can get to the user, if you can convince the user to do something that enables you to get access to that data or their user profile, etc., that's really where we've seen all the a lot of the attacks shifting. Actually, 7 out of 10 vulnerabilities are very, very heavily focused on things like Flash and QuickTime. Internet Explorer still as well, but we're seeing that actually start to tail off a bit as the more user-centric applications that are used by all these devices are being targeted. So what we're actually seeing in the market, or certainly what I'm seeing in the market in the US, and from my experience in Australia, is when we carry out our overall security architecture assessment, which is a much broader review, we're seeing some real gaps in particularly people, process, and policy aspects across most organizations, and particularly the BYOD end user compute space has got the biggest gaps. They're an area that often have grown organically. I know that both Jaco and Neville have some really good input from their perspective on this, but certainly that's an area that I see most organizations say, okay, we've got some BYOD, it's been forced by the business or by a business requirement. We haven't yet got that under control. We kind of know we need to, but we don't quite know how to. So there's a definite need for cohesive policy across all those systems, users, applications, and devices. And one of the biggest challenges is obviously that we're seeing that 76% of the vulnerabilities on those systems are actually at least 2 years old, and some of them are actually as long as 10 years old. So that's like a real challenge for all the regions. So I'm going to pause there and just pass to Jaco for his introduction and his perspective.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, I would most probably like to carry on with the theme around soft, and to say, well, for me, end users is really the soft target. It's this is one of the key takeaways that I'm taking out of that report, is that it not only is end users becoming, they are soft targets, but they're easy targets. There's so many different multiple attack vectors that you can actually attack those kind of users on. And it's not just the endpoint, it's the devices, it's all kinds of aspects, including social engineering as well. And I think it's also worth mentioning that from a security perspective, when those end users are being attacked, it is not from a personal perspective on them, but really they act as a gateway to information, and that is why they are becoming more and more important. And I think we can build a lot of systems in the background to start mitigating these attacks, but people are fallible, and they must probably, and that is essentially why I think there's such a big focus on that. The other thing, which is, and I don't think this is going to change, and it's going to change soon, because really, if you look at some of the bigger trends in the industry, specifically around things such as consumerization of IT, where a lot of users are bringing up devices into the enterprise, connecting those devices to the network, wanting to access corporate information. This is only going to increase. So from that perspective, you can understand why more and more of these attacks and these security threats are being focused on specifically on end users. Just to a couple of points on BYOD, and so what I thought doing, and most probably just sharing some of my comments is, I'll share with most probably a couple of comments that we're seeing from a global perspective, and then I'll hand over to Neville to give you a little bit more regional flavor. But the one thing we're seeing is in a lot of organizations, in a way to mitigate some of those threats, are really rethinking, in a lot of cases, their strategies, and specifically their strategies around BYOD. We've seen a significant amount of organizations trying to move away from BYOD. I mean, is this the end of BYOD? I don't think so. But in moving away and putting a lot more standard devices, this is the device you're going to use. I mean, we as Dimension Data has done a significant amount of these migrations already, and we see an uptick on that. So as organizations standardize on a device, it becomes easier to support it. It's easier to actually also mitigate the threats, and also to make sure that those devices are at the appropriate patch levels, etc., etc. So that is essentially the one thing we see. The other component which we also seeing is really, as I said, going back to the end user, is really to try and govern his behavior. If you can behave users in a consistent manner, in line with certain kinds of processes and procedures, and you're not going to take those attacks away, but certainly it's definitely going to make it, make the organization a lot more safer. So from that perspective, we see a lot more organizations focusing on establishing centralized policies, or almost universal policies that cuts across all of the endpoints, the mobiles, the tablets, the PCs, etc. And those policies being administered and essentially developed centrally, administered centrally. And also, I think the one thing what we're seeing is organizations becoming a lot more cleverer in building those policies in a way that they can be enforced, and in that they can actually be reported on, violations can be noticed, etc., etc. And I think what you want to do is you want to take a lot of that information and feed it back almost in a continuous loop system back into the organization. Because ultimately what you want to do is you want to start educating the users. So those are some of the global trends we see. And so let me hand over to Neville, and Neville can give some perspective of what he's seeing in Asia.
Yeah, thanks, Jaco. Some great insights there. And within Asia Pacific, we cover a very, very large region. We go from the Pacific with Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands there, right through to some pretty network challenged environments from Indonesia, Philippines, right across to India and China and Japan. And so we have some very, very different cultural and usage scenarios, and what we've typically seen in countries like Australia, New Zealand, US, UK is a fleet managed approach where we've managed not only PCs but tablets and mobility in a highly managed way. Bringing into BYOD, and really with Asia accelerating the consumerization with a mobility first strategy, they really are bringing on mobile devices faster than fleet managed devices. And so that really is probably exposing that softness even more in Asia. So we are seeing an explosion of mobile devices. These devices are being used into work, and we are seeing that most BYOD environments are lightly managed at best. So we are really seeing that softness, and the millenniums and Gen Ys all using social media over those weekends, coming into work and causing a little bit of grief within the organizations. What we've seen though is a change in strategy for a lot of clients, and what we're seeing there is that BYOD is being morphed into a COPE strategy. COPE being corporate owned, personally enabled. So maybe we go and supply the devices, we are able to have a degree of lockdown or a degree of inspection around the OS to keep them patched. I see 76% of compromised devices were ones that hadn't been patched. So how do we go and inspect? How do we disintermediate the OS to the data to the applications, and then allow the personal enablement, allow the users to put their desired device applications on those devices? So yeah, we're seeing kind of a weird mix here in Asia, from a high degree of management in certain countries to a coping strategy in a lot of maturing and accelerating countries where they're using mobility first.
Yeah, certainly from my perspective in the US, I would agree, never on having worked in Australia for 5.5 years and running some of the bigger enterprise mobility projects. It was and is, I think, a very traditional kind of focus, and certainly I've seen organisations in the US pulling back from rolling out more BYOD in terms of in the US people tend to call it CYOD, choose your own device. Yeah, the same principle really of here's a list of devices that you can choose. We'll manage that device, but gives the user some level of flexibility. They can still put some of their personal applications on there and so on. But I think also it's key for us to when we're discussing this is a much broader issue as well. Mobile devices, tablets, end-user computer devices, laptops. I mean, certainly there's lots of people that are wanting to bring in their own, particularly Apple PowerBooks and different types of devices. And again, from a security architecture perspective, we're working with a lot of our bigger global clients on mapping out their end-to-end business policy-driven architecture. So where we go back to them and say, so what are the key business assets at a very high level, if it's data, operations, whatever that happens to be, and then making sure we flow that all the way down through their architecture, all the way down through how all those different components are managed. And importantly, I think to Nava and Yaku, both to your points, is managed and monitored, and then that feeds into the other big gap that we see, which is 76%, I think it is, of organizations don't have an instant response plan. So how do you respond if one of your users is compromised? And all of a sudden, there is no instant response process that will detect and then put into effect an instant response plan to secure your key data. So for the last few years, we've been spending a lot of time with clients focusing on what we call data-centric security. So let's put some controls and monitoring in that even if a user is authorized, let's just make sure they don't do anything that's really out of their normal behavior. So dumping 2 gigs of a database for a mobile device that's connected, it wouldn't be normal. So that's some of the areas that's definitely what I'm seeing, what I'm promoting with all of our clients is start at the business level, flow it down, be comprehensive, educate the users, put a lot of focus on people, process, and making sure that the technology that's in place is effective, and then looking for those areas where we can add very key types of technology to mitigate a specific risk that is appropriate to the client.
I have to say, Jason, from my perspective, I had a very interesting experience, I would say, over the last, say, 2 or 3 weeks, and that being that I'm an end user, and everybody on this Hangout, we're all end users, and so in accordance with our own governance and compliance within the organization, I had to go through security training. And I consider myself quite a fay with this, but I was actually quite astounded as to all of the various kinds of gaps, things that I thought I knew but I didn't. So from my perspective, I think as we move forward, for me the most important thing is really going back to those soft targets, or essentially those end users, and really starting an education process with them. I mean, it's not just around educating about the technology, but also the systems, the processes. What is the implications of not being up on the latest patch levels? Also, I think you mentioned anomalies, but I think a lot of employees would most probably spot an anomaly, but most probably don't really react onto it. And so to that extent, is also to understand those processes. I think the other thing which was very interesting for me was around a lot of the social engineering attacks that is happening, that is focusing on end users. I mean, I certainly was, I think, vaguely aware of it, but was not aware as to what extent some of those attacks can happen. And I think it was also interesting for me to understand how those relate back to the bigger policies inside the organization. And I think, the one thing which I can most probably only advise any organization to is, you can do education, but ultimately what you want to do is you want to heighten the awareness of end users. And this is certainly what happened with me. I mean, after I've been through the training, I understand a lot better. I am at least a lot more aware. And I think for me, the question, or essentially the approach would be, is to have a structured approach, drive that through the organization, and actually tie that back to the policies. We spoke about the universal policies, how that can be applied, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's also important that users understand those policies. But in certain cases, also, a lot of those policies are going to be violated in a way. I might load an application which I'm not allowed to. I might bring one of my jailbroken devices to the office and connect it to the corporate network. And I think users don't always understand why those things are particular. I think sometimes they feel they're just being policed. But I think so there's those kind of things, and I think organizations can most probably, based on the cultural nuances, also decide how they want to apply those. And I think those are also different from region to region. So Neville, I don't know if you want to add a few things to that.
Yeah, I think that last bit that you talked about was very relevant for Asia and culture. First of all, I'm going to go right back. Acceptable use policy is probably one of the cornerstones of getting that awareness out there, and basically being able to say, well, this is acceptable use regardless of device, whether it's our own device or one that you are bringing in to the office or using for a work activity. We do expect that acceptable behavior on that, which won't put you at risk of some of the social engineering and that. And I think that's the awareness bit that you're looking for. However, incidents will happen, and I think Jason just highlighted that where is that incident response plan and inspection of the devices, so that you can actually pick it up, because in an Asian culture, people won't willingly say, well, I do have a virus, I do have something. They will it's a loss of face thing to say that you've made a mistake. So what we actually need is a very good reporting and insight engine to be able to say, well, we think that you may have something wrong with your machine. Can we help you with that? And that's a lot better way of working with it. So not only the awareness, but understanding that today in this world things will happen. We need the inspection. We need the response that can be either automated or in a way that will help our users and not put them in an embarrassing position, because in that case they will choose to hide or not report, and that's the worst thing that we can have in this sort of scenario.
Yeah, certainly. So our acceptable use policy, we always ensure when we're talking to clients, that has to map back to their business objectives and their key business assets. So one of the keys there that we see is make all of these policies really relevant to what is most important to the business, and that's very different. I mean, I'm working at the moment with vastly different organizations, global financials, global manufacturing companies that are completely different profile, retail companies, but all of them have one thing in common. Every organization has key objectives, and out those key objectives, they're underpinned by some key systems and data. And as long as we collectively translate these policies into, that is, you said that this is the most important thing to you, this is your key business asset. Maybe that's SAP that underpins your whole manufacturing plant. And you want to enable mobile devices to connect from some users to enable that access to those systems, etc. That's great. Then we need to translate it into things like the acceptable use policy, inspection, control. So even if an organization says, yep, I need to allow BYOD, that's great. We still need to define those policies and then the controls that set a threshold to say, okay, it's okay to bring a BYOD device, but if it's jailbroken, that represents too much of a risk to us. So we're either going to alert, you can choose to alert or control, but at least there's that visibility to give you the awareness so you can then do something about it. Feeding all that information in and correlating it and managing it, which is, this is something that obviously the Global Threat Intelligence platform has been doing, it's proved does very well. Gives you these, it's like these hallelujah moments when you say, wow, is it really that much of a shift? Most of our attacks are coming from this location, this kind of attack, targeting these kinds of users with this kind of profile. It makes it a lot more relevant to the user at the end of the day of, we're trying to do this to help you, to help us, to basically support the business that we all rely on because that's who pays us. And that's a lot of what we're doing now is running through the whole process and giving that bi-directional traceability from here's a control or a policy, but that relates all the way back up to what the business needs to achieve. And that's something that we're firm believers in, and really end user compute is a component of that. And as we can see, that's a massive component that's been targeted by anyone who's trying to gain publicly identifiable, personally identifiable information, credit card details, IP, whatever it happens to be, because now networks are increasingly very well defined, segmented, good controls. So it's predictable that we're just going to see the attacks have shifted to the softer target. And unfortunately, as everyone's very social, well, almost everyone I know anyway, and certainly the younger generation are very, very socially connected across multiple social networks. It's very easy or relatively easy to target a user based on everything you know about them to get them to do something that looks okay, but then relates to gaining privileged access via them to the data.
Good.
So I don't know if you had any wrap-up comments, Jaco or Neville.
Maybe just from my side, I think what we have seen just from an end-user computing perspective is I think just to some of the comments you've just made, Jason, around all the it just speaks to all of the complexity on actually developing those policies, implementing those policies. From our perspective, from an end-user compute point of view, we have realized that you need to take in cognizance of multiple different factors when you actually go about developing these policies. And so we've developed a unique consultative-led model that we actually go through with our customers to actually drive that engagement across multiple stakeholders and really to define and develop a roadmap for any organization, not just to embark on this journey, but to make it safer and also to almost form a baseline that one can start working from. And so that's essentially our approach. I think the other thing which is very important from a dimension data perspective is we bring all of the various components together in that engagement. That obviously allows us then to play to the strengths of Dimension Data in the various areas, whether it's in security or in networking, etc., etc. So for us, it's that comprehensive approach is what we feel is the best approach to actually mitigate all of these threats.
Mm. We were discussing this before before the session, and I came up with the 3 or 4 P's that you should be thinking about. People, and what do you do with your users? They are the heart of your business. Effectively, they're wanting productivity, but again, they may be doing the wrong things, and acceptable use policies, the BYOD, the COPE strategies, CYOD is another way of doing it. So really looking at people, productivity, because we can't do things that lessen the business's efficiency. This should be doing. And then finally, policy and protect. So what is that core end-to-end policy? And Jason and Jaco, you've talked a lot about that. And then the inspection, reporting, and policing around what is happening underneath, so that we can actually have insight of what's going on in our mobile fleets. And I think quite often a lot of businesses today are quite blind of what's really happening at the edge there, and no wonder it's a soft belly for them. So that's mine. People, productivity, policy, and protect. Easy.
How many P's is that, Neville?
It's only 4 now.
4 P's.
Gone down to 4 P's. Yeah, from the very security focused, direction that we talk about. We very much talk about we've got the 4 key tenets that we work on, really, which is visibility, awareness, protection, and agility. So end user compute mobility is firmly in the agility space. So we've got to do all those things and be agile. So everything that we're doing as a team, global team, is all about creating that agile, business effective working environment for ultimately the end users to gain access to the data and the applications that need to be more productive, in healthcare, provide better care at the point of care, etc., but still maintain an appropriate level of security around that data, particularly the data, and a lot of that is to do with policies, alerting, keeping control, knowing where you are, so you can actually then mitigate those risks. The end user compute world will just continue to develop and explode for sure. The usage will definitely increase. I'm seeing very big global clients that I'm working with going very heavily into mobilizing their workforce and mobilizing some of their key applications and access to key data. So there's no doubt that we've got a lot of work to do. Luckily, I've worked for Dimension Data now for 7 years. Luckily, we've done so much work in this space over, particularly over the last 5 years, that we're perfectly placed when we go into those big clients. So okay, we've tackled this before. This is how we've tackled it. Here's where we see that there are the obvious gaps in what you're doing already. Give them a very clear roadmap. Combination of security architecture and end user compute consulting, and that is really what most clients are looking for. From my experience, is tell me where I am, tell me where I need to go to achieve my outcomes that the business is asking me to achieve, and help me on that journey. Give me the help I need, to provide the solutions or the services to do that. So that's kind of my wrap up. That's just my wrap up comment. I mean, we have a lot of experience in this space, so we've obviously invested a lot in things like the global threat intelligence platform to create the data that we're then talking about on this hangout and the previous hangouts. So from my point of view, I'd just like to thank everyone who's joined for viewing, and look forward to any comments and questions via the hashtag DD Hangouts, so that we can provide you more value.